Trigger warning. This podcast episode contains details of emotional and physical abuse. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Sarene Leeds, and I'm so glad you're here. My apologies for the lack of new episodes over the past couple of weeks, but if I'm being perfectly honest, this unexpected hiatus hasn't hurt the podcast in the slightest. Our download numbers are actually up, and I'm so grateful to everyone who spent the past couple of weeks catching up on the 12 episodes currently available. I'm so excited to share today's episode with you, but as always, I have a couple of announcements. First of all, I'm happy to reveal that Emotional Abuse is Real finally has its own Facebook page. You can get all the latest information about the podcast on this page, in addition to, as always, on my Instagram at Sarene Leeds Writes. I'll leave the link to the Facebook page in the show notes. Also, Emotional Abuse is Real still needs your support, and there are several ways you can do that. First, if you're a listener and you've been mulling over sharing your story, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via Instagram, our new Facebook page, or via email. My email address is hello@sereneleads.com. A reminder that anonymous guests are always welcome. Also, if you are a mental health professional and would like to offer your clinical insights, I would love to feature you on the podcast as well. Another way you can support Emotional Abuse is Real is by heading over to Apple Podcasts and both leaving a rating and writing a review. The more reviews we get, the easier it is for people to find this podcast. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, you can support the podcast by donating to our Buy Me a Coffee page, which I've linked in the show notes. As I've said before, this is a one-woman operation, and your donations help fund the podcast's production costs. On today's episode, I'll be chatting with Carol Ann Lapeyrouse. Carol Ann reached out to me a few weeks back to share her story, and this one is a heartbreaker. She was emotionally abused by her mother. Carol Ann talks to me about how she decided to distance herself from her mother for 15 years and how she finally found a way to forgive her mother before her death. I'm amazed by the mental health work Carol Ann has done over the years, and I'm proud to reveal that she's currently working on a memoir about her trauma. My final reminder before we get into the episode is please know that I understand the content on this podcast may be difficult for many of you. I've spoken to several people who want to listen to this podcast and who do want to share their stories, but they just don't feel ready to do either yet. I'm here to tell you that I completely understand your decision. As I've done on previous episodes, I am more than happy to narrate your story if you don't feel comfortable appearing on the podcast. Also, please know that it's taken me nearly a decade after my own emotional abuse experience to be able to talk about it so openly. I'm always happy to chat with you over Instagram DM, the podcast Facebook page, or via email. I'm at Sarene Leeds Writes on Instagram. That's SareneleedsWrites. And hello@sereneleads.com if you want to shoot me an email. That's HELLO@SareneleeDS.com. Or if you would like to reach out to me via our Facebook page, the Facebook page's name is just Emotional Abuse is Real. So without further ado, here's Carol Ann's story.
Good morning, Sarene.
Hello.
Yes, my name is Carol Ann Lapeyrouse, and I'm thrilled to be here today.
I'm so happy that you're here, and thank you so much for reaching out and your willingness to tell me your emotional abuse story. So I want to just give you the floor right off the bat. And if you could please share your story with me and our listeners
Absolutely.
whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarene.
My pleasure.
Before I start, I'll give you a
Mhm.
high-level idea of what I'm going to cover.
Sure.
In my case, my abuser was my birth mother.
Mm.
I'll start with basic facts about my family and myself, my mother's characteristics, my characteristics, my reactions to my mom, my relationship with my dad,
Mhm.
and finally, my parents' relationship with each other.
Yeah.
Then I'll describe the stages of my life and give your listeners multiple examples of the emotional or physical abuse in each stage.
Okay.
Then we'll get to the 15 years of estrangement, followed by forgiveness, confrontation, and finally reconciliation.
Okay.
So let's get started. A,
Yeah.
coup a couple of facts to begin with. I'm a member of the baby boomer generation.
Mhm.
I was born in Seattle, Washington. I lived in Seattle through the fourth grade. From the fifth grade on, we lived in Kenmore, Washington, which was at that time an unincorporated town by the north end of Lake Washington. This story starts at age 6 and goes up to 50 years of age. It starts in the year 1955 up to the year 2000.
Mhm.
I come from a family of 5. I had a mother and a father. There were 3 of us kids. My I have a younger brother who's 2 years younger and a sister who's 7 years younger, the baby in the family. I'm the oldest. My siblings and I always agreed on how my mother treated us, although we each have a slightly different experience with her. Of the 3 of us, I would say that I received the worst treatment because I was the oldest.
Mhm.
Now, in looking at my mom's characteristics, if I had to describe her in 2 words, it would be number 1, controlling, and number 2, critical. She was unsupportive, overreacted to minor incidents, she belittled, she berated, she issued threats, and she was impatient, especially when teaching me how to do something. Her parenting style was authoritarian.
Hmm.
She was the boss.
Yeah.
One way and only one way to do anything, and that was her way.
Mhm.
She was always right, and conversely, she was never wrong.
Mhm.
She apologized to me twice in her entire life. The first time was disingenuous. The second and last time was genuine. She did not acknowledge or address negative emotions exhibited by us kids. She did not inquire about them, and she did not comfort us. Lastly, she had issues with her mother. I could see that this toxic mother daughter relationship was intergenerational. For that reason, I decided emphatically in my 20s that I was not having kids, and I didn't.
Mm.
I effectively cut off my branch of the tree. My branch of the tree stops with me and my husband.
Mm.
I have been married to my husband for 42 years. It's a first marriage for both of us, I'm happy to say. And we have one cat named Sweet Girl. As for my characteristics, my mother claimed from the get go that I was high strung, which is another word for sensitive. And it's true. I've known I'm what's known as an HSP, which is an acronym that stands for highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
I'm intense as a personality, meaning I'm not laid back. I'm an extrovert, albeit a low extrovert, and I easily swing over into the high introvert.
Mhm.
I'm basically a perfectionist and I'm a workaholic.
Mm.
So now let's talk for a moment about my reactions to mom.
Mhm.
As a child, I was very much afraid of her.
Mm.
Lifelong, I suffered from anxiety to varying degrees. For example, when I was an adolescent, I'd wake up on Saturday mornings with a stomach ache because I was anxious. And the reason I was anxious is that I had to know what kind of mood she was in so I could cope with her. And being in this anxious mode, I became hyper vigilant. Um, that that's what was resulted in a hyper vigilant behavior
Yeah.
on my part. My reaction to her was either bewilderment, hurt, or anger. In a nutshell, I did not understand her. And worst of all, I was obsessed with her. I was obsessed with what she said and what she did. When I was in junior high, I never lost an opportunity to describe my mother's behavior to my best friends. For example, I rode the public school bus in junior high to and from home. Then, frequently after getting off the bus, I'd spend 15 to 20 minutes telling one of my best friends about the latest drama with mom. My need to complain about her continued as an adult. For example, I discussed her with a best friend and more often than not end up in tears. In other words, the hurt was always there just below the surface, waiting to pour out. My relationship with my dad was just the opposite of the one with my mom. He was the loving parent who wasn't around that much. My parents' relationship was touch and go, up and down, in and out. They argued periodically from the time I was a minor child. On a few occasions, they got into physical fights, which I heard but never saw because I was always in bed for the night when they occurred. During one argument when I was in high school, my mom actually called the police on my dad because she was afraid of what he might do. A police officer came to our house, and this was very shocking because this had never happened before. So now let's go back and start with elementary school. This is grades 1 through 6. There were one physical incident that occurred, which was actually the worst. When I was in the first or second grade, I was not in the most skilled reading group, which was called the Busy Bees. And the teacher suggested that I bring home a reading book to practice, which I did. And one day I was sitting there at the dining room table reading. My mother was standing at the ironing board, ironing something. I ran across a word that I had run across before and I couldn't sound it out. She told me what it was. Here was the same word again. She told me to sound it out. I sounded it out. It did not sound like anything that I recognized. It was w he I to That was the sounding out. She became so frustrated with me that I couldn't remember this word, that she grabbed my hand and pressed the hot iron on it. Directly on it, saying to me, "This will teach you to remember that word."
I'm so sorry.
Ah,
I knew that was coming as soon as you said ironing.
I'm telling you, Sarene, that was the all-time worst. And it was not the all-time worst in terms of physical hurt. Of course, the burn healed, but in terms of my not understanding her, I could not grasp that at 6 years of age. And I vowed at the time to tell my dad, which I did not until I was in high school. So moving on, just to illustrate my fear of her, she gave me a dime. And the purpose of the dime was in case I needed to make an emergency phone call. So I put the dime in my little coin purse, and my little coin purse went in my little purse. On the way home from school one day, I checked my coin purse to be certain that it was there.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, it was not. Oh, I flew into a panic. What was I going to do? She told me not to lose it. She emphatically told me not to lose it. I did not know where it was.
Mm-hmm.
So what was I going to do? I ran across the street to one of my best friends, knocked on the door, and asked the mother for a dime, for basically a replacement dime.
Yeah.
The mother said no.
Mm.
Oh my goodness. I just couldn't believe it. So
Yeah.
I ran across the street the other way, knocked on my other friend's door, and asked her mother for a dime. And her mother said, "Just a moment, honey, I'll get it for you." The mother brought the dime. I thanked her profusely because, as far as I was concerned, she was saving my life.
Yeah.
And I put the dime back in my purse. I never said a syllable about this to my mother. I had been saved.
Yeah.
Moving now to junior high, the grades of 7th, 8th, and 9th, I can tell you that my mother had two faces. The first face was the interior mean face, and that was the face that we saw behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
The other face was the exterior cordial face that she presented to her friends and to my friends.
Yeah.
For example, my friends would come over to visit with me, and my mother would lay out 6 different cookies for them. Of course, they loved the cookies. And my friends would tell me that they never saw my mom being mean. And the bottom line here is that my description of her did not match what they experienced with her. In junior high, I was convinced that I was the only person in the entire world who had such a mean mother. I didn't have any friends who had a mother like mine, and I felt absolutely alone in the universe. No other mean mother like this existed, I was certain. To give a couple more examples, my mother was an excellent tailor with years of experience. But at that time, I was a beginner. So she was busy teaching me to sew. If I had a problem with sewing, all you know what brought loose.
Yeah.
For example, if the zipper wasn't perfect, I'd have to rip it out until it was perfect. And worst of all, she was mean about it. She was nasty. I had trouble understanding the pattern instructions. And again, she had very little patience with that. And each of these incidents, these sewing lessons, would end with me in tears.
Yeah.
In junior high, I tried out for a drill team, but I didn't make it. I was not awarded entry on the drill team. And my mother told me in a nasty voice, "You didn't make it because no one likes you."
Oh, good Lord.
I remember this so well. And once again, I was just bewildered.
Yeah.
I just couldn't make sense of it. You know, I thought about it. Is that true? I just couldn't make sense of it.
Yeah.
The other very, very perplexing behavior would occur when we'd go to church. The 3 of us kids and my mom would go to church. We'd be sitting there. I would be sitting there in the pew with her on my left, and she would inevitably start weeping as the sermon is going on.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, she's reacting to something that the minister is saying. But, all right. And then she'd wipe her tears, she'd kind of halfway take off her glasses and wipe her eyes. And, okay, fine. But the problem was on the way home. 15 minutes later, we're in the car and we're driving home, and she begins berating us. Over what? I cannot even tell you now. This would happen routinely. This type of berating, and it was a haranguing. My sister and I would always end up in tears. one day she did this, and I was one Sunday, and I was so tired of this. She said, if you don't stop crying right now, I am going to stop this car and you can walk home. Well, I almost took her up on it.
Yeah.
I was so fed up, but the only reason I didn't was because it would have been about a 5-mile walk.
Yeah.
So I thought better of it. My need to complain about her continued as an adult. For example, if I discuss her with a best friend, more often than not, I'd end up in tears. The hurt was always there, just below the surface.
Sure.
Moving now to high school, grades 10, 11, and 12. As it happened, I had 3 best friends. One of my best friends, I became very close to her family, and I referred to her family as my surrogate family. Her father was a child psychiatrist, of all things, and her mother acted like a loving and supportive mother to me. And the reason for this is because her mother was difficult for her. So this is my surrogate family. I spent considerable amount of time up there. I liked being with them, and my mother was basically jealous of that fact. 2 incidents occurred in high school. Again, I was in tears over something. I couldn't stop crying. And my mother, this happened in the bathroom. My mother actually put both of her hands around my neck and told me to stop crying. She then slapped my face, which resulted in a bloody nose. And once again, I'm looking in the mirror with blood dripping down my upper lip, and I'm not understanding her. I can't make sense of it. And I'm just so sorry that I'm in this situation. I feel helpless, and I can't get out of it.
Yeah.
She's my mother, and I live there.
Yeah. Yeah.
One other time in high school, my mother came home from a bridge club meeting. She was in this bridge club with these friends, with these other women friends. I was in bed. I was fully asleep. My mother comes flying into the room and starts yelling about whatever. Again, I had no idea what she was talking about. I couldn't make sense of it. I had been dead asleep. She walks over to my open closet, grabs a hunk of empty hangers, and literally starts whacking me as I'm laying in bed with the hangers.
Oh my God, that's straight out of Mommy Dearest.
This was straight out of Mommy Dearest. And when I did see Mommy Dearest,
oh God,
I sat there and just cried and cried and cried and cried and cried.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Because I just, all of a sudden I'm seeing a replay in a movie of what actually happened to me.
Yeah.
OMG.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just couldn't believe I was seeing on film what had actually happened to me. Okay. I could not make sense of this situation with my mother. She left the room. The only thing I could determine or think about was that somehow I had said something to somebody, and somebody brought up something at this bridge club, and it embarrassed my mother in some way. So therefore, she was furious with me. I never really knew what it was.
Yeah.
The final episode in high school was during this time. I was on the swimming team, and we belonged to a membership pool, which was on this hill in this community. My parents deliberately lived in this community so we could join this pool and we could all be on the swim team. So, I was 16 or so at the time, and I decided I wanted to lighten my hair, which had been a lovely mouse brown, and I couldn't stand it. So I said, okay, I'm going to lighten my hair with this product called Summer Blonde. So I did that one day. And in the downstairs bathroom without my mother knowing. And my mother got into a fight with my father. They were arguing. And my mother told my father, your daughter looks like a whore. Oh my goodness. I had never heard this word mentioned in my house at all.
Sure.
Much less being applied to me.
Yeah.
I was shocked and I couldn't believe it. During this time in high school, I had my first cigarette and I had my first alcoholic beverage, which was a beer. Okay, now I go away to college for 4 years, and I go away on the eastern side of the state to get away from her, basically.
Sure.
I joined a sorority. My mother, as it happened, despised smoking and never smoked herself. But I had had my first cigarette in high school. So just to spite her, I smoked in the rec room of the sorority house, knowing that she hated it and loving the fact that I could do it. I was rebelling and I was in control.
Yeah. In a weird way, she was right about the smoking, but,
She was right about the smoking.
I get why you did it. Yeah. I get it. I totally get it.
Oh, of course, I was only hurting myself, as you know. But I didn't care at the time.
Sure.
So, during college, one time I was home on semester break. I had been out partying the night before. I woke up at 11 a.m. Okay. My mother comes down. I was downstairs in my brother's bedroom, sleeping there. She comes down and she tells me that while I'm under her roof, I need to abide by her rules. And that does not include sleeping in till 11 a.m.
Okay.
She had in her hand at the time a plastic plate that she had been drying. And she was so irritated with me that she hurled the plate at me. It hit the wall and fell on me. And all this time I'm laying in bed. So here we are. I decided that I couldn't stand it. From my perspective, I was on break. I had absolutely killed myself studying. I took my grades very seriously.
Yeah.
And I had earned the right to let loose. How dare she tell me that I can't go out and have fun? So I called my dad. I told him about the incident, and I left the house. I stayed with a best friend who was in a dorm at the University of Washington. There were 2 semester breaks. I did not go home because I didn't want to deal with her. One, I stayed on campus, and the other, I visited my aunt in Victoria, British Columbia. One summer, I didn't want to go home, so I lived in a boarding house with a close friend. And as it happened on my 19th birthday, my mother came and visited me at the boarding house. We were sitting on the bed. She was there in person, and she got into some dialogue and stated that she wished she had never had children. Well, I was the child sitting there, and it was my 19th birthday. I didn't know what to make of it again. And in the same conversation, she told me that she felt suicidal.
Wow.
My response was unsympathetic. I told her, you better get yourself together. I felt no compassion.
Yeah.
And I didn't take it seriously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I had no idea why she felt suicidal.
Yeah.
And she didn't say, and I didn't ask.
Right.
We now get to the young adult years. I'm calling them the young adult years from 21 to 27.
Okay. Yep.
Within 3 weeks of graduating from college, I moved to LA
Mm-hmm.
to Southern California with 3 college girlfriends. I lived in the beach communities. This was about 20 minutes south of LAX.
So
And
cool.
during this time, I experienced a tremendous sense of freedom
Mm-hmm.
and relief from school and from mom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was free of school and all that pressure and having to perform, having to get good grades, and I was free from her.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was absolutely glorious.
It's great.
Then,
I'm so glad you did that for yourself.
Yes. At 28, I decided I wanted to get into graduate school. And the reason for that is I wanted to get the MBA degree because at that time it was the degree to have.
Yeah.
I had been in admin jobs, which I despised because I didn't like being the right-hand person for anybody.
Yeah. You wanted to be the one in charge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted to be the one in charge. Why did I have to maintain a calendar for some VP?
Ew, no.
So I pursued the schooling. In 1981, I met my husband. We got married. I was 32 and he was 30. The good news is 42 years later, we're still married.
That's so wonderful.
From the beginning, we had issues as a couple, however.
Well, who doesn't?
Exactly. So we ended up in couples counseling.
Good for you.
And that was wonderful. This was before we got married. We learned a lot. But the therapist told me at that time that I needed to work on my mom. She could see that I had issues, of course. But my attitude at that time was I absolutely did not want to work on her. I didn't care about her. But I did want to work on my husband because I loved him and we were going to get married, which we did.
Okay.
So.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you have been in therapy.
Yes, it was very beneficial.
Good.
Sarene.
Yes. Because I always say it on this podcast, I am not a mental health professional. So I highly recommend therapy for anyone who comes on this podcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So then I get into what I'm calling the adult years of ages 35 to 50. Okay. By this time, I had 2 full-blown addictions. One to alcohol and the other to nicotine.
Sure.
So at 34, I quit smoking. At 35, I quit drinking and went to AA for 14 months.
Good for you. You quit smoking around the time my dad did in the mid-'80s. Good for you. Around the same age, around the same time. Good for you.
The 2 best things I've ever done in my life,
good,
Sarene, were quitting smoking and quitting drinking.
Good for you. I'm very happy to hear that.
Thank you.
Of course.
So after 14 months, I left AA. And during this time, which was in the 80s, I went to therapy. I was in therapy a number of different times. I read, I don't know how many self-help books, and I participated in probably half a dozen 12-step programs.
Sure.
But in spite of all this, I was still filled with hurt, anger, resentment, and rage. I was still obsessed with my mother.
Yeah.
And I developed this gnawing suspicion that the only way I was going to get rid of my emotional baggage was to talk to my mother in person.
Mm-hmm.
Life continued on. I pursued my development path. I got into a program called LifeSpring, which was a personal growth program.
Mhm.
Then I was involved in a program called ASCA, ASCA,
Mhm.
an acronym which stands for Adult Survivors of Child Abuse.
Mm.
This was an excellent program. I participated in it for about 2 years.
Okay.
It was not a 12-step program, but it was extremely validating because it acknowledged physical, emotional, and sexual abuse,
Sure.
whatever the
Yeah.
abuse was.
Good.
Sobriety, as it happened when I got sober at age 35, that
Mhm.
was the beginning of my estrangement from my mother.
Mhm. That
When
doesn't sound surprising.
exactly. When I stopped drinking, I had to deal with all of the feelings and the issues
Yeah.
that the alcohol covered up,
Yeah.
namely the hurt, the anger, the resentment, and the rage.
Sure.
I realized as a newly sober person that I was too vulnerable without the fortification of daily or nightly alcohol to deal with
Mhm.
my mother.
Mhm.
I did not see her or speak to her for 15 years, and
Mhm.
this was from 1985 to the year 2000.
Wow.
I knew I couldn't see her until I was emotionally ready.
Yeah.
So, what happened was that in July of 1993, I
Mhm.
received a letter from my mother's lawyer. Okay. My mother's lawyer was threatening me with disinheritance. OMG. When I received this letter, I was enraged
Yeah, I don't blame you.
because the wording of the letter was such that she was threatening me with disinheritance based on our poor relationship.
Sorry. I'm not laughing at you or her. I'm just yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
But why was the relationship poor? She was
Mhm.
blaming me for the poor
Mhm.
relationship, but the
Yeah.
poor relationship resulted from her mistreatment of me
Right.
for decades. I was so enraged by this that I actually had to have an emergency visit with a therapist.
Sure. Sure. I get
And
that.
yes, and after this emergency visit,
Mhm.
I participated in a group therapy
Mhm.
situation.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Okay, so time went on, and in 1995, I worked in the tech world. I entered the tech world for the first time,
Mm.
and I was there for 25 years.
Mm.
When I started in tech as a technical writer,
Mhm.
my anxiety absolutely exploded.
Mhm.
There were constant deadlines. I was constantly overwhelmed. The
Mm.
workload was unbelievable, and it was expected that all of us perform, no matter what, no matter how unreasonable it was.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
once
Yeah.
again, I got into therapy for anxiety. I and I also got on an antidepressant.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm. Mm.
I got onto medication for this because
Yeah.
talk therapy was not enough.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. Oh,
So
I get that.
yes. So then in the early 2000s, I
Mhm.
read a book about highly sensitive person.
Mhm.
Now, this was a revelation because as it happened, this was the last piece of my personal jigsaw puzzle.
Mhm.
After the alcohol and the anxiety and the cigarettes, I learned that I have this trait called high sensitivity.
Yeah.
And as a highly sensitive person, I'm highly intuitive.
Mhm.
I'm prone to overthinking things, prone to overwhelm, prone to worry, sensitive to external stimuli such as noise,
Yeah.
but also highly apathetic and compassionate. Okay, fine. I understood who I was after 50 years. So the turning
I just
point
wanted
of
I'm sorry, I just wanted to I just wanna make sure
sure.
that you're saying, that you're highly, empathic, because it came out sounding apathetic. I don't want people to think that you're apathetic, because we know that you're not. We know that you're not.
Thank you for that correction.
Of course. No, please. I just want to make, listeners, Carol Ann is not apathetic. I'm listening.
She
I'm
is
just like,
empathic. Thank you.
Absolutely. Of course. Please.
Okay. So when I turned 50, this was a huge turning point for me.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you know it? Out of the blue, now remember that I hadn't talked to or seen my mother for 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the mail, I received a check for $5,000.
Okay.
All right. My reaction was that my mother either felt guilty for the mistreatment or she was more likely trying to buy her way back into my good graces.
Mm-hmm.
Although I was ecstatic about the money, I was really PO'd because it meant that I had to thank her for the gift.
Yep.
And I was still angry with her.
Sure.
At this same time, I happened to see an article in the local newspaper about forgiveness, a forgiveness course that was going to be taught at Stanford University, which was available to the general public.
Oh, that's great.
The following week, I saw another article about this same course, and I decided this was a sign.
Okay.
I had been thinking about the possibility of forgiveness because I decided I was sick and tired of being sick and tired with this terrible emotional baggage, this albatross around my neck, this monkey on my back that I had been carrying for 15 years. I needed to get rid of it. It was half a century already, and I did not want to carry that for the next half a century.
Yeah.
I took the course. It was absolutely fabulous. It was taught by an expert who has a program there at Stanford. I found myself in a room with, 30 other people with fantastic resentments about various people in their lives. And I completed the course. I will say that the forgiveness process was a process for me. It did not happen by simply saying, I forgive you, Mother. It took about 3 to 4 months before I felt that I had truly forgiven her.
Wow.
The next thing that happened was in the year 2000, my dad died. I went home to Kenmore. Arriving home, it had been 15 years, remember, since I'd seen my mother.
Right.
She appeared shorter than I remembered, with short gray hair, plus about 30 extra pounds, smiling and hugging me as she greeted me and my sister. She just looked like a kindly little old lady, not the mean mother that I once knew. So what happened was on the third day of my 3-day visit for my dad's memorial, I walked into the kitchen and found my mother making tea. The moment I'd imagined for a lifetime was finally here.
Yeah.
In a calm, even voice, I began telling her how I felt about the way she treated me for the first 50 years of my life.
Yeah.
I cited specific examples of physical and emotional abuse and the impact it had on me as a child and adolescent, and now as an adult. Standing at the corner of the kitchen counter, she began to weep. As I continued speaking, she became increasingly distressed. Bent over the counter and sobbing with her head in her hands, she repeated, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. Despite her sobbing, I continued my speech. Having rehearsed it in my mind dozens of times.
Of course.
I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I told her that although she had inflicted a tremendous amount of pain on me for decades, I had forgiven her. I also stated that my future relationship with her, if there was to be one, was contingent upon mutual respect, and that I would not tolerate under any circumstances any form of abuse from her ever again.
Good for you.
I felt triumphant. I did not yell or scream. I spoke calmly and evenly, factually.
Yeah.
It was the summation of 50 years of hurt, anger, rage, and misery spoken in a steady tone. So what I did was I effectively looked the tiger in the eye, as my father recommended that I do so many years before. After coming back into my mother's life, I had another 9 years with her.
Okay.
And I realized that I had simply grown up during that 15 years of estrangement. I had, in fact, separated from her emotionally. I was no longer dependent upon her for approval or permission to do, think, or feel anything. I was an adult. I was finally looking her in the eye and telling her how I felt about the decades of abuse. It was the most powerful moment of my life because I had never stood up to her before. I had never expressed how I felt about it directly to her face.
Wow.
Now, I will say that forgiving my mother was a priceless gift, unlike anything I imagined was even possible. The 50-year obsession with her and all my negative emotions about her absolutely vanished. I no longer replayed the victim record in my head, recounting over and over to myself and to anyone else who would listen all the negative nasties she said and did. The emotional shackles fell away. My energy was freed from the mental prison built of hurt and deep resentment. I have forgiven her, but I have not forgotten. In 2009, my mother was on her deathbed in a hospital in Seattle.
Yeah.
And I said goodbye to her from a conference room at work in California.
Oh.
My final words to her were, "I love you, Mom." My suggestion to survivors, Sarene,
Yes, please.
is that if you need to distance yourself from a family member for self-preservation purposes, give yourself that gift.
Yeah.
With distance and perspective, you will realize whether forgiveness and or reconciliation are in your future. Thank you, Sarene.
Oh my God. Thank you, Carol Ann. I am so moved by your story. I am so grateful to you for sharing with me. And I just want to say how fortunate you are that you were able to have those final 9 years with your mother and that you were able to speak your truth and that she was able to hear you and say, "I'm sorry," because I think in a lot of cases, I don't think emotional abuse survivors get that because of the issue with the abuser, because of the way the abusers are. And, you know, there's, like you said yourself, there's so much intergenerational trauma there, issues that your own mother wasn't able to sort out herself and get her own mental health help for. Yeah, I just want to say how fortunate you are that you were able to forgive her and that she was able to say, "I'm so sorry."
Serene, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I think that my case is actually on the unusual side.
Yeah.
In that, as I'm sure we both know, abusers more often than not do not admit to the abuse. They don't remember it. They never said it. They never
Exactly.
did it.
Exactly.
In my case, I never predicted that this would have happened. I never in my wildest imagination thought it ever would. And I certainly didn't see myself as forgiving her. I absolutely did not see her in my life again. Uh, so, another part of this is you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Never say never.
Sure. Absolutely. I just feel that from what you told me of your mother, it just really sounds like she had a lot of her own trauma that she was never able to work through. And I'm sorry for that. You had that gift to be able to work through everything, but she didn't, which is a shame. But I know that that's also common for older generations.
Yes. Looking back now, I absolutely believe that my mother's issues stemmed from her issues with her mother.
Sure.
And my father actually wanted my mother to get into therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And my father asked her father to pay for it, and he
Wow.
would not.
Ah.
This was, back in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And therapy at that time was not in vogue. So
It took many decades for that. There's even most people who listen, they know that I covered the TV show The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and it took place in the early 1960s. And they even gave one of the characters a couple of lines of dialogue where he viciously dismissed therapy. And
yes,
because that's what it was like. Yeah.
yes, you didn't talk about it. If
No.
somebody had an emotional issue and was unusual in the household, it was not discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It was usually ignored. It was not paid attention to, and it was just hush, hush.
Exactly. I would say my generation is the first in my family to really truly embrace therapy. It was encouraged by my parents, but I'm like the first one to just be like, therapy is amazing. It will help
Yes,
you. Don't be embarrassed by it. Please,
yes,
if you need help, get that help. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So what I wanted to also do is give you an opportunity to share where people can find you, your website, and if you want to share a little bit about the memoir that you're writing. I'd love to hear about
Sure.
that.
Sure. First of all, Serene, thank you so much for
Oh,
having me on your show
my pleasure.
and,
Thank you.
and allowing me to share my story with other emotional abuse survivors.
It's my pleasure, and it's so important. I'm so grateful to you for speaking your truth and for sharing this story, because that's the whole reason why I started this podcast, because it's still relatively taboo and I don't
Yes,
want it to be anymore.
absolutely. Your listeners can
Mm-hmm.
find out more about me at carolanlapeyrouse.com.
Mm-hmm.
That's one word.
Okay.
That's my full name, and I'll spell it. It's CarolAnnLapeyrouse.com. You can connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Okay.
I'm in the process of writing a trauma memoir based
Mm-hmm.
on my emotional abuse story.
Okay.
Additionally, I post a monthly blog that comes out on the first day of every month, and listeners can sign up to receive it on my website.
Wonderful. And I will also include your website, your LinkedIn, and your Facebook in the show notes so that listeners can find you. And I wish you all the best as you continue working on your memoir. And I look forward to seeing the finished product. And Carol Ann, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Sarene.
Thank you. Thank you once again for listening to Carol Ann's story on Emotional Abuse is Real. If you would like to connect with Carol Ann, I've included her website and social media information in the show notes. And if you would like to share your emotional abuse story here on the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out at hello@sereneleads.com, via our Facebook page, Emotional Abuse is Real, or through Instagram at Serene Leads Rights. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, that's START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you can, please support us through our Buy Me a Coffee page. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.